Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. I'm a former journalist who wants to help tell amazing stories by asking questions. Everyone has a story to tell, and listening to someone speak their truth and their experience is one of the most human things we can do. More than ever, there's a general lack of willingness to go deep to understand why people think, act, and believe like they do, especially when there are differences of opinions. My goal is to counter that by exposing the stories that deserve to be told, so that we all might better empathize with the people, the human beings around us. My hope is that along the way, this show provides you an example of what it means to listen more than you speak, so that you can become a more thoughtful and informed person. So whether you're a journalist, a podcaster yourself, a blogger, someone who wants to learn how to be quick to listen and slow to speak, or someone who just likes to hear great stories, this is the show for you. And today on the show, I welcome Jay Acunzo. Jay's a guy I've followed as a marketer in my full-time job for quite some time now. He used to be a Google employee and is now the founder of a company called Marketing Showrunners. He has several different podcasts to his name, but in particular, 3 Clips and Unthinkable. He's also the author of the book Break the Wheel, Question Best Practices, Hone Your Intuition, and Do Your Best Work. Jay is an adamant supporter of storytelling and shunning best practices for the good of getting it right. That best practices aren't always about getting it right, that best practices more often are about not screwing it up. And I love where this conversation goes with Jay. We talk about everything from when he first began to question best practices to his love of Anthony Bourdain and how he told stories, this radical notion of thinking for yourself, or this idea that thinking for yourself has become radicalized. We jump all over the place in this, but the key theme is storytelling. Jay is passionate about it, as passionate as anyone else that I have ever seen or spoken with, and I greatly enjoyed getting the chance to sit down and chat and pick Jay's mind for an hour. And you guys are going to absolutely benefit from that. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Jay Acunzo. When did you first begin to question the idea of best practices?
My first job out of college was at Google, and I heard all these ridiculous buzz phrases that the business world just accepts, right? That you hear all the time and even start using yourself. But when I was just out of college, I was like, what the heck are you talking about? Up and to the right? Like, what does this mean? All these different phrases, even just the idea of like, will it scale? This like common idea that people talk about. And best practices was something that people at Google threw around all the time. And so being the snarky sports journalist wannabe that I was, I created an internal power rankings, like an ESPN columnist might, like ranking sports teams. But instead, I ranked the buzzwords that my team would hear all week long. And every Friday, I would publish a new edition of The Hornet, rankings of our buzziest buzzwords. And I would just write little ridiculous things like, oh man, I don't know. Best practices is looking up at the number 1 spot. Like it's my right to be there because I'm going to be true to my name, or, something stupid like that. Scale up is looking down at niche down, and, niche down is looking up at scale up. Like I would do all this random, like stupid copy blurbs next to these words. I just feel like somewhere along the lines, you start to learn to act like a drone in the business world. And one of those things becomes the best practice because somebody declared it the best practice. It must be true. And the issue is that the best practice in general is not the best practice for you. And the difference is usually some kind of variable or multiple variables that are present in your unique situation that the expert, the guru, even your past self, or the history of your business, there was no way they could take that variable into account. And there's just story after story about why you should not blindly cling to the best practice. And yet you can find example after example of people trying to do exactly that. And so I went on this like 2.5-year journey, probably starting, I guess, 4 years ago now. So it lasted 2.5 years of me trying to find stories of people who question best practices. And it seemed radical. But when you talk to them, it seemed like the smartest thing they could have possibly done.
Yeah.
It's because from the outside, we didn't know what they knew because they were in their own unique situation. So if we make choices based on our own unique situations, I think we'll find the best approach for us, which is the goal. never the best practice.
You and I are kind of kindred spirits in that I hate cliches and I consider those like the ugly cousin of best practices.
Sure.
I had no idea you were a sports writer. I am a former sports writer as well.
Oh, nice.
What was your background there? I'd love to just know.
Yeah. I was an English literature major in college.
Yeah.
But I always had an interest in writing sports. So, freshman year, I started writing for the student paper as, a sports reporter. So I would go and talk to people on my college's various teams and, worked my way up to being sports editor, and then had a couple internships throughout college at print papers, mostly local.
Yeah.
Then a statewide paper in my home state of Connecticut called the Hartford Courant.
Know it
and then I interned at ESPN, actually in their PR department. So it wasn't quite what I wanted to be doing, but it did show me how you can use writing in other places within business. And so, I fell in love with the idea that sports is this like nicely contained microcosm of humanity, and all the metaphors and analogies and storylines and, lessons you'd hope to learn. It's just contained. It's like a little snow globe you can turn over and over again and find all these meaningful stories about people. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write meaningful stories and tell meaningful stories about human beings. And being a sports fan, I found sports to be rich with that.
Gosh, that is so that nearly mirrors my journey through sports. So awesome. That's crazy to hear that. Jay, what happened that you said, okay, this is some funny little thing that I'm producing every time I hear a best practice or these jargony phrases around Google? What took place that caused you to set out on the journey that you did? Like, how did you begin to take action versus just roll your eyes at it and say, it is what it is?
Yeah. I mean, I felt like I was taking crazy pills every time I would propose to, say, like a marketing team at a startup I worked for after Google, like, hey, maybe we could write like high quality things instead of just more things. Like, maybe we should serve the audience first instead of our lead number first. Like, maybe we should do these things. It sounded like I'm speaking to human beings instead of optimizing for an algorithm. Like, maybe we should do the first principles based, human based stuff first, and the results we seek will follow a lot easier. But instead, everybody was agonizing over things because, shrug, they were trends, or someone told them that's the best practice, or, on and on and on, reason after reason. You can kind of sum it up as conventional thinking, which is really dangerous because those are always rooted in the past or in a generality. You do not operate in the past. You are not working in a generality. You are a specific in the present trying to move into the future. Like, what are you doing? And so the frustration that I just articulated, I felt in multiple jobs. And it led to this one conversation I had with a friend over beers, probably in 2013, when I explained to him all these things going on in marketing that was really obnoxious in my mind. And I just couldn't stand, I just felt disillusioned. I'm like, I just spent 6 years of my career working in the wrong field. What am I doing? But I did find some kindred spirits. And he looked at me and he said, this is a friend of mine named Andy Cook. He's the founder of a software company called Tetra. And he looked at me and he said, oh, you're somebody who's bothered by suck. And I was like, that's it. And so I didn't know where else I was going to go from there. But I wrote a blog post that evening called How to Work in Marketing When You're Bothered by Suck. And I said, my intention in this article is essentially to stop feeling like a lone little penguin wandering out in the cold, send up a flare. And now I'm mixing metaphors because apparently as a penguin, I had a flare gun. But send up a flare so that others can come waddling to it. And maybe together we can explore a better way. And I called that better way Unthinkable. And I named my podcast Unthinkable. Yeah. And away I went on this like 2.5 year personal journey of finding people who thought like I did, telling their stories, trying to tease out insights and methodologies. And eventually it culminated in my book. And the best part of that whole process, by the way, was way more than marketers felt that way about best practices and conventional wisdom, and how it was doing damage to their own intentions for their career, to their companies and their brands, and most importantly, to the communities they wanted to serve.
You've poured yourself into uncovering why it is that the people who go against best practices are the ones that succeed. And even what you just said there, Jay, they feel it was that best practices harm their career and don't put them in the best position from a company standpoint. Why are we so drawn to best practices? Yeah.
So, a couple things. So first of all, the book's subtitle says question best practices, not reject, because I do think that's the more important thing. Oh, wow. Thanks. You have a copy. That's awesome. Thank you. So I intentionally want people to question best practices and say that word instead of reject, because the most important thing is you do what's right for you. So like when I left Google, for example, I was miserable, didn't like the job or the company, but lots and lots of people liked the same job I had and liked the business we worked for. And I thought at the time they were wrong. And no, they're just different than I am. And that's fine. That's all careers are, is this constant motion forward, this constant self-discovery period, and trying to use your self-awareness to make the best choice for you. And I just didn't have that self-awareness back then. So I thought in absolutes. So I think that's the problem, is we think in absolutes because it is the best practice. It is the trend. We start with the tactic. We start with the conventional wisdom. And it feels like this endlessly spinning wheel, which is why the book is called Break the Wheel, where it's like we're strapped to it and we feel like we have a bunch of options, none of which are actually the right ones. Like the system that we use to make choices is fundamentally broken. We need a new system, which is what the book is about. So how do you make choices that are right for you? You can't rely on the same approaches to decision making as before. Now you asked why we make these choices the way we do. Endless reasons, but there's really a big one, which is called Pike syndrome. So another way of saying Pike syndrome is learned helplessness. And so imagine a pike in an aquarium. This is an old science experiment that explains our behavior. If you dropped minnows into the pike, or into the tank rather, the pike would eat the minnows right away. That's obvious. But what scientists found is they could lower in those minnows surrounded by some glass, and the pike, who couldn't see the glass, would smash into it until he trained himself that he couldn't eat minnows. And then you could let the minnows free and they would swim right in front of the pike and not essentially get eaten. The pike would never move because he'd learned this form of helplessness. And I think that's what we suffer from in the workplace way too much, because we're told at a young age in school that there's a right and a wrong answer. And because we now live in a world where everybody with a Wi-Fi connection professes to have the right answer. So now we have infinite right answers for everything we hope to do in work. And because we all occupy these jobs that are complex and ever changing, what we do is we try to look for the right answer. The problem is, just like with the pike, we have these tasty little morsels floating by our noses every day. These like firsthand anecdotes and evidence and, results of tests and things we can do in our own scenarios right in front of us. And we just discredit them. We just think, well, what could I possibly know or do? So we go seek our answers in some vague sense of like out there from them, or that person I admire must have some secret. You see secrets to success being shilled all over the place, and it's BS. So that syndrome, Pike syndrome, I think is trained into us, and we have to learn how to essentially get over it as we enter the workforce.
Where does Anthony Bourdain fit in all this? Like, where and how did he inspire you, man?
If you ask me about Anthony Bourdain, you instantly become my favorite interview I've ever done. So we're there now. I believe that Bourdain, who is my storytelling idol, the name of his last show was Parts Unknown. I saw him speak live twice, and I thought about asking him this question both times when he did audience Q&A, and I didn't, and I wish I had now. I would have loved to have known if there was a sneaky double meaning to the name Parts Unknown, because what he does or did so well was he reached these emotional and intellectual parts that felt like it was impossible to reach in some day-to-day thing. Talking to a food truck owner, talking to a family around grandma's dinner table. Yes, he would sometimes visit exotic places, but when you're there, surrounding the exotic things you'd never seen before were very normal interactions with normal people, right? I mean, that's one of the things he did so well, was show the humanity in everybody everywhere. But he found such meaning in the day-to-day, and he was able to pull it out through asking simple questions, through telling simple stories. I am one of millions of people who would say this, but I would aspire to tell stories like him in my world. And my world happens to be business and career, or if you want to go more narrowly, creative careers or marketing. And so his storytelling style has influenced me very heavily. In addition to just being a fan, I love studying how he told stories and how he comported himself in the world. Like one of the things he had tattooed on his body very famously was a Greek phrase that translated into the phrase, "I am certain of nothing." And there's the best practice questioning right there. It's like, I am certain of nothing. Everything's a test. Everything's a moment to learn. There is no one project versus another project in my career. It's just one project. It's the body of work. Everything I do teaches me something and prepares me in some way for the next thing. And the only way to proceed in that line of work, in my line of work, is to question everything. And start at the first principles of why something bothers you, or can you find common ground with someone you disagree with, or why are people debating something that you feel is just a complete given in the world. So that you can zoom out and talk about society and culture through this lens. You can zoom in and talk about making podcasts and building brands, right? So the way he comported himself in the world, plus the way he told stories, I think has had just a profound impact on my life.
Why has storytelling captured, I'll say, your heart the way that it has? You even mentioned it in sports writing too. And yeah. I agree, but why for you?
I mean, I like to feel stuff. I like to be alive, right? So like I like to make things that I feel something strong about and then put it out in the world and be like, hey, I made this, and have them feel what I wanted them to feel, right? There's something so ridiculously magical. It is manipulative, but you can use it in a place of generosity to put out something in the world that you're like, I put this joke here so you'd laugh and open up, and then gave a heavier point on the back end of that joke so you would now listen. And so you'd internalize it because you're vulnerable, because you're listening because of the laughter, and now you're kind of open enough to my serious point. I do this on stages as a speaker, in podcasts, everywhere. So like the created work is manipulating your emotions. And you can use that for bad, or you can use that for infinite good. And so I think like I always felt strongly about the stories that impacted me. But more so, like I kind of snuck it in there as you were asking your question. What else is there? Like we make sense of the world through the little stories going on in our mind of how we feel about stuff, and the background that we have as people affects how we interpret certain things, be it political or social or communal or in work. And so we are story-driven beings. So it's just that I think a lot of people take that for granted, and they don't realize like these are things you can study. These are things you can learn. These are things you can create. So for me, I just think, why story? It's because that's how I make sense of my own place in the world and my relationship to it. And if I can also then help you find and share your own voice and make something that makes a difference, however you define that, that's what my work is for. Like I make stuff for makers. I want to help you find and share your voice and make stuff that makes a difference.
How have you seen what you just said be manipulated for nefarious reasons? How does it manifest itself when somebody takes the idea of storytelling and manipulates it, to your point, for not good?
Yeah, I mean, you have the radical right, you have the fake news movement, you have the ability to like basically lie and gaslight, and then you narrow it down to people that maybe their intentions aren't even that terrible. Like maybe they're not evil. They're just working at a corporation and they have a number to hit and they're stressed that they're going to lose their job. And so they write clickbait headlines. I'd point to my experience working for the tech company HubSpot. Like they're really great people who work at that company and who I worked with. And yet we would do shit like publish an ebook that sounded amazing in the title and the description on a landing page. But to get the ebook, you needed to fill out a giant form, become a lead for the business, and then marketing and sales would beat the shit out of you, right? Like this was called lead nurturing. No, lead bludgeoning, bludgeoning. And like, so we were telling the story of the ebook. Well, if you open the ebook, it was written by an intern who had no writing chops, who was a marketing major, who wanted to work in marketing, wrote a 45-page ebook about something strategic in marketing that a CMO then downloaded, probably opened up and got annoyed at. Right. So that's like using the storytelling ability of like how you position something for bad. But on the flip side, and just, putting aside the political stuff and staying at home in business for now, you can use business as a force for good. I published over the last year and a half, I was building a documentary series with a brand called Help Scout called Against the Grain. And what we want to do is replace the typical...
It's great work, man.
Story.
I've only seen the first episode, but it's great work.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about it. But basically, like, this is an example of storytelling used for good, I think, which is the business success story that we applaud, especially in America, is really damaging to teams. They burn out, a lot of depression. It's really damaging to communities. It's really damaging to the globe. The story is hypergrowth, winner, take all, monopolistic aims. I'm going to get mine no matter what you think or do. Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn. I don't know the man. I have no doubt that he has a million good bones in his body. But the book he wrote, Blitzscaling, and everyone's like, oh, great, this is an awesome concept. Blitzscaling is just a get-rich-quick scheme that got an MBA. Like, we applaud this fast hyper-growth, be number one, and push away everybody. And then we're like, but we should regulate Facebook. And why is Facebook being so damaging? It's because we are in a system that the whole goal is to be Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg is a product of where we live and how we operate. And so what we need to do is replace the archetypical success story. It shouldn't be winner take all. It should be craft and community and customer driven. It should be people over profit and mission over metrics. And so the documentary series is a hunt for those types of people and teams to try and elevate that story. And we're not alone. You're seeing podcasts like Ted's Zigzag from Manoush Zamarotti, I think is her last name. And you're seeing these entities like the Long-Term Stock Exchange from Eric Ries, and the Zebra United community, which is about a new type of startup, not unicorns, but zebras. But all these businesses are coming together, B corporations, a legal standing. You are legally accountable to things having to do with more than your shareholders, your team, your community, the environment, etc. So there's like business for good is bubbling. And I think the way you make it boil isn't any one regulation that passes or even multiple. It isn't 2 or 3 more giant companies like Patagonia. The way you make this movement boil is you change what people think of as the success story. Like, that's how humans work. Like, the reason skeptics don't believe in climate change, like, first of all, global warming, total mistake. Climate change, it's changing. Things change all the time. Deal with it, right? I heard a couple people say this before. I'm not the first one to come up with this, but if you said climate cancer, right, or climate disease, or just straight up pollution, now the story sounds more severe and the skeptics might get on board. So changing the story is changing people. If you want progress, you need a better story. So that's the power of story for good.
How do you find the stories that you're telling in that series or the companies that you highlighted in Break the Wheel? How did you come across these companies?
Specifically in Against the Grain, or are you looking for how we come up with the stories specifically, or how one comes up, like the methodology to come up with great stories?
No, how do you find the companies that are doing this? I'll say the right way in air quotes, but the coffee company, Death Wish Coffee, for one, which was in the first episode of Against the Grain, and I believe also in Break the Wheel.
Yep.
There are other companies like that. Are you just always on? Are people coming to you? Or are you always on the lookout for these companies? Like, how are you finding the examples of these companies that are doing it with a little bit of I don't know, purpose behind it, other than, like you said, just reporting to the board?
Sure. Right. So it starts with, we have this vague idea with this premise that we want to test out. And that's what it is. It's like, we have more questions than answers on Against the Grain, which is how I approach Unthinkable too. We have more questions than answers. We just have to start and then reassess. And I think that's a healthy way to position anything serialized, because, there's too much going on in the world of people who say they're experts. I have the answer. I think it's far healthier to say, I have questions. I'm going to go explore and try to find the answers. And by the way, to your audience, you can say, come with me, right? Yeah. Join this journey, subscribe. So that's what we're doing with Against the Grain. We're saying we have questions about why people don't think like this. Who does think like this? So it's all we could do early on to just find these companies. And it was a slog, asking our networks, asking the team at Help Scout, which is the customer service software company that bought this idea or funded it. Actually came out of Nick Francis's brain. He's the CEO. And he brought me in to help sort of direct and write and host.
Yeah.
And so, it was basically a grab bag of like, seems cool. We can reach them. They're willing to talk. But now I think you make a switch in a show like that, which is, okay, we've told a few stories. When it's safe to go back out there and do more, let's start with questions that we have or ideas that need exploring and see if we can find a fit for that, right? So like, you might start out by saying, I'm going to find 3, 4, 5, whatever seems small to you that just fit the general premise. And then after you do that number of episodes, you look backwards and you're like, but that leads us to this next big question. So who could answer that question for us? Do we have to go sit with a company? Do we need an author, a scientist, someone in academia? Are we trying to look at the anti version of this and profile somebody who's not doing it right? Or, is it a cautionary tale we need? So you start to look at more like audience specific needs and questions, or journey specific needs and questions. And you find subjects that fit into that to help you answer it. And in the process, you also find ones that don't fit those specific questions, but you're like, I'm going to save these because later I think they'll serve a purpose. So I think the sum up of all of this is it starts with a great premise that you work hard to develop. And that's all in theory. Then you actually have to go out into the world and make something. And so you should start with what feels right early on, because you're going to change rapidly early on anyway. And so now once you start doing that, you can switch from I'm leading with the story to I'm leading with the idea to the question, and I'm finding the story that fits it.
You didn't say it outright there, but the phrase that comes to mind is trust your gut or trust your instinct. Is that...
Yeah, your intuition.
Do you feel like that is making more of a headway in marketing and in business in general, when for so long, and HubSpot being one of those companies that really champion this, we were data, measure, track, extrapolate numbers across the board, like for everything. Do you feel like there's an undertone of a shift there?
So a couple things. So one is data doesn't mean numbers, right? Data just means information stored for later use.
Good
so
point.
Things that are qualitative, like people saying nice things, or you observing the world and making judgments on the world or asking questions of the world, like little story threads you find, it's all data. The problem is we get so exceptionally, we get aroused when we hear like numbers in business, right? And it's like ridiculous. Like, chill out, pour some cold water on yourself and take a beat. Like, what you've just done is look at what happened in the past, and it didn't tell you anything. It just told you what happened, not why it happened, or not what you should do next. I'll give you an example. There was this guy I encountered while writing the book. Oh my goodness, I'm blanking on his name. But he's a data scientist, and he's working with an airline at the time. This is probably a decade ago. And he found that, so the airline hired this data scientist to look at the numbers and figure out who makes the stickiest customers, the most lucrative customers. One of the problems the airline was suffering from was empty seats, right? So had they known you weren't going to show up, had you proactively canceled, they could have sold that ticket again or whatever. Like, the worst thing to happen to an airline is they assume that you are there and you're actually not. And then the plane takes off with a lot of empty seats. So they wanted to fix that problem. So they brought in this data scientist, and he was looking at how vegetarians missed fewer flights than any other cohort of people. All right, that's what the numbers said. The more important thing is what you do based on the data, right? Like, it's information stored for later use. How do you use that? A bad approach is to go by the numbers. A good approach is to go by your intuition. The numbers say vegetarians miss fewer flights. There's your answer, client. There's your answer, airline. Book more vegetarians, right? Okay. Logically, intuitively, you're wondering as a human being with creative taste, why? Why are vegetarians more likely to show up, purchase stuff, upgrade, etc.? Well, it's because what they found was vegetarians were more likely to request a specific vegetarian meal. And by requesting a vegetarian meal, they'd customize something. They'd have to interact with the website or the brand more. So they're reminding themselves implicitly that the flight is coming up so they don't forget, right? And they maybe have something to look forward to. Okay, so it's actually about number of touch points between when you book and when you show up, customization options, making the flight feel like a great experience, all these things that the numbers do not point to, but human beings can pull out intuitively. So whether it's numbers, qualitative feedback, like I talk about the 3 S's of data, it's stats, surveys, and statements, right? Things people say to you. We need all 3. And the problem is with some marketing, it swung too far into stats, and that anchored us even more fully to the best practice or conventional wisdom, right?
Yeah.
List articles blew up.
Yeah.
Why? Because it was easy to measure that list articles got clicks. Why? If we ask that question, maybe we'd realize, people are pressed for time, or people need complexity distilled to simplicity. There's infinite ways to address those 2 human needs, right? And it involves your intuition, asking why and pursuing it, looking for insights, not numbers.
What other, as you've done your research, Jay, what other things have come up that have been just unexpected that you you found something or you heard something or you saw something and said, I had no idea that was going to happen or that it was going to be that way?
I think sometimes I'm surprised at how there's so many things that like, I kind of want to write this book someday. I'll call it Things They Don't Tell You. There's just infinite tiny little things that like if career services was at all in touch with the real world of work, because most universities, they're not.
Right.
Mine certainly was not.
Same
Or,
here.
you know, if you had good mentors, or if school wasn't about this false idea of the career path prepackaged and selected for you, which is quickly becoming a fiction in most fields. You know, there's a few exceptions, of course, but not for most of us. There's all these things that you're not told. Like, for example, your 20s are about trying stuff. Really, your whole career is about trying stuff. Try lots and lots of things. And when you stop learning, leave and go on to the next thing. Some things that people say are good for you are not going to be good for you. Like I did the right thing in air quotes. I was working for Google out of college. I was a good student. I joined the clubs and the teams. I wanted to be in leadership roles in both those things. Then I got the job. I got the quote unquote A+ on the report card that was first job. And I was miserable. Like my brain was not prepared for that because no one told me that what you should do is not what you, that like the quote unquote best practice is not necessarily what you are happiest doing or is right for you specifically. So the advice when someone says, hey, you should do this, well, you better be damn sure that they're a mentor who intimately knows you if they're saying that, right? Not some blogger on Medium that said that they did it and you can too. So there's all these little things like that people don't know coming into the workplace that you rediscover no matter how old you are. And they're always simple. They're always human, right? Like take visionaries as one example. What I found is once I get over my kind of gag reflex when people are like, this is a guru, this is an influencer. When I got past that and I was like, all right, well, who are these people? You start studying the ones that you can tolerate that don't clearly have some ulterior motive, the people that actually are servicing the world. They're like, I want something to be better. I'm serving my community. You find those people and you dig into their work. And what you find is people portray these visionaries as having a vision of the future, but they don't. They have a vision for the future. The difference is they're saying, hey, something about the status quo is broken. That's their vision. They see clearly what's going on today, whereas most people are looking backwards to inform their movement forwards. So they see clearly what's going on today and how it's broken. Then they say, how should this unfold as we move forward? What is the better way? I see a mountain peak in the distance, and I think we should go in that direction. I have no idea how to get there. Like, I don't know exactly the path there. I can't see the future definitively. It's blurry. But I have conviction that we should do things differently and better. I'm going to build stuff to make it happen. So visionaries are asked to say, what is the future of blank, the future of work, the future of sales, the future of tech? I think in reality, nobody knows. And these people we admire when they do things the right way, they don't have a vision of the future. They have a vision for it. They're building the future that they'd like to live in.
You very briefly in passing, really early on in our conversation, Jay, mentioned the radicalization of thinking for yourself. And you even talk about that concept in the book, Breaking the Wheel. Yeah. What do you mean by that? The radicalization of thinking for yourself? Yeah,
I mean, like this, it comes in so many flavors. The obvious, the common is like when your boss tells you to do something, the inability that so many workers have to say no, or to question why, or to propose something better. It's because you're here to be a cog in the wheel. Like education is about compliance. So you must now comply because you're the student and I'm the manager. That's not how that works. So it comes up in that. But the larger flavors are like this idea culturally that someone who's a think for yourselfer is a genius or a guru, or they're kind of an outlier, they're weird. You know, if I say that person's a real think for yourselfer, you're like, all right, they're difficult, or maybe if they aren't, they're some kind of genius, or maybe both, right? You start talking in these extremes. But what you find is that where everyone is trapped to this kind of what they call cultural fluency, you know, things appearing as you expected them to means your mind is off, you will react. This is yet another quarter doing sales. I'm just going to go with the flow. My boss told me to do something. I'm going to go with it. We make a lot of mindless decisions. Sometimes voluntarily because we just want to get out of there. But most times we don't notice it. That's called cultural fluency. To make something culturally disfluent, in other words, snap yourself out of mindlessness and become mindful and therefore make better choices, you don't need to do anything radical. All you have to do is ask better questions. Just ask open-ended questions. Like, why is the simplest one? Why are we doing this? Why am I spending my time on this? And even if you're not doing it to push back, you're just like, hey, I'm just curious. I want to learn. You're smart boss. I want to learn from you. Why are we doing this? Then they equip you with more knowledge than you had, and you can come up with an even better solution, right? But it all comes back to the same willingness to say, I don't have the answer, but I'm still going to figure this out. And it's just this comfort of we have the answers or someone else gave it to us and I can follow the list. That brings us so much commodity work and conventional thinking. So yes, I think we've radicalized this notion of being a think for yourselfer. I don't think it's at all radical. I think it's table stakes, especially in creative work like ours.
Is that for somebody who's listening and saying, I butt up against best practices every day and I want to try new things and I want to test new things. To your point, what you were just saying, is your recommendation just to ask more questions? Because I feel like some people would be like, I'm just going to beat my head against the wall here until I bloody myself. Is it like, how does somebody work themselves out of that situation or find the best path for them?
Cool. So before I can answer that, there's a million variables I would need to say, here's what you should do, right?
Yeah.
So I'm taking my own medicine,
Yeah.
following the advice of the book. The book does not propose a system. It proposes questions you should ask and maybe how to come up with your own types of questions or your own specific questions, because I give you the categories of them. And then I propose 6. So it's like, I can't give you a best practice if my whole thing is questioning best practices, right? But here's what I'll say. In every career choice, like you just painted one kind of choice, like what do I do because I'm butting up against the same old, or a boss who's rigid or whatever. While I can't tell you what to do, here's something to look for. Control and certainty are 2 things that are present, 2 elements of every job or project. Control and certainty. So control and certainty over the direction you should head, how you'll measure success. Will the money show up in your bank account however many times a month? Will you still have a job? Will the company still exist? Will your hours be predictable? Control and certainty. The thing is, and this is one of those things they never tell you, those are inversely proportional to each other. So if you have total control, you have no certainty. Total control is, I left my job, I started a company from scratch, it's day 1. I have total control, I have 0 certainty. As I start to figure out how to build that business, I start to find systems that can recur. I start to find people I can rely on. I start to hire those people in full-time or part-time roles and give some of the work to them. I start to give up control in favor of certainty. And when you work for a corporation or you work for certain types of bosses, what you have to realize is typically, not always, but typically the bigger the business or the more conventional thinking they are around leadership being command and control top-down style, the less control you have. And so what you want to do is make sure you're trading it off for more certainty. So like an absolute nightmarish situation is you work for a massive corporation that gives you a giant problem and there's just endless roadblocks. So you have total control over this project and no certainty that you'll have a job. It's like, congratulations, Michael. Big piece of this project is yours. By the way, if you mess up, you're out of here. And also all the systems about a big company are still around you. So you're going to get blocked every which way to Sunday and not get anything done. Or on the flip side, you join a startup, no certainty at all, right? And maybe there's also like somebody who's trying to control you as a manager. So what you need to figure out is, what do I value and to which degree? There's a woman that I keep talking to over Twitter who works for a giant software company. And she keeps beating her head into the wall. She's like, I interviewed at this startup. They can't pay me as much as the big company can, but the job itself seems better. But I can't in good conscience leave this company because the brand sounds so good on my resume. And also like, it's only been 2 years. Maybe I should stay longer. So I'm like, here's what you're vacillating between. Do you want control or do you want certainty? You can't have both to equal degree. And you have to figure out as one moves up, the other moves down, where are you comfortable? So now back to your scenario. I keep hitting my head against the best practices of my business. My boss is blocking my work. I want to be more creative. I want to trust my intuition or whatever. Well, the first thing to do is figure out in that role, one extreme is I'm unhappy because I value total control and someone's blocking me, right? Great. That's such a good insight. Get out of Dodge. Leave that boss inside the company, leave that company, right? Just know what makes you happy, or embrace that there's a trade-off at least, that if you want certainty right now because of, I don't know, family situations, that you won't have control. And you just have to accept that like some of these things around you may not actually get better, right?
Yeah.
But you have a career path ahead of you and you can move and vacillate. I wanted total certainty at Google. I was unhappy because I realized about myself, I value total control. Fast forward 10 years, I started my own company, right? And now I want more certainty because I've had so much control for so long. I'm ready to give up some of it. I just have to be aware of what I'm trading off.
What does that trade-off, or what does that mixture look like from the companies that you've been highlighting over the last several years that are going against the grain or are breaking the wheel? Like what have you found that what's the mixture from those companies for that certainty and control?
I think they treat their people like adults. They don't fake.
Yeah.
They don't fake it out. Like they a lot of bad companies and bad leaders feign giving you control when what they really want is certainty. Like an example was when I worked for Google, we essentially the economy was terrible. Not as terrible, unfortunately, as we're living through right now during COVID, but it was pretty bad. And they had to lay off some of our team. And the whole goal of our early days on the sales team there was to actually work in customer support. We'd train, take calls, chat support. That taught us the product. That taught us about the clients we worked with. Then we would sort of graduate, quote unquote, to sales. That was the job we were hired for. Well, my hiring cohort across the country basically got stuck doing phone support for way longer than we thought was going to happen. So we were all very unhappy. And part of the unhappiness was the fact that we were all kind of high flyers, driven people. We all valued control, right? To a degree, like control over the types of, we thought we had gotten the job and we didn't. It was at the right company, wrong job. And so they tried to give us all these bullshit projects. That's like, we're going to optimize these clients. So like, we're going to turn reactive inbound customer support calls into proactive sales opportunities. And essentially what they would do is use all these vanity metrics to measure how we would do that. And so like they created systems, they created projects, they dangled carrots to try and appease an unhappy group of employees instead of addressing the real issue. The real issue was we thought we would have more control over what we did at Google, and we had none, right? And they just didn't treat us like adults. Whereas the companies that were profiling it against the grain, for example, they are totally transparent about the mission of their business. They align the team around that mission. They give the people on their team autonomy. They do not manage top down. They are not command and control. Everybody has a different part to play, and everybody owns that part. So they happen to attract people who value control. Now, there's nothing wrong with people who want certainty in their careers at all. But you just have to know that those people are going to need probably a little bit more instruction, or they're going to want to clock out right at 5 and not think about work. That's not these companies. These companies have a higher calling. It's imbued into their lives outside of the office or away from their inbox. It's a way of operating as people. And part of that operating principle is we work for this company, right? And then I also volunteer at this charity and I have these principles with my kids or whatever. It's part of their identity to be at that business, right? So again, there's nothing wrong. Control and certainty are inversely proportional. There's nothing wrong with saying you like an extreme one or the other. It's just the self-awareness that you need.
When you think of the companies that you've worked with and interacted with, which one comes to mind when I say, what's the best story you've heard?
It's so hard to pick one because honestly, and I'll give you the truth here, mostly because if you ask me, they're all blurry. They just blend together, right? Because this is what I'd say. It's like being a chef. Maybe this is the Bourdain inspiration here.
There you go.
What's the favorite dish you've cooked? It's not that necessarily a chef likes cooking specific dishes on the menu. It's that the chef likes cooking, right? So like Death Wish Coffee, they were on my podcast, in my book, in my speeches, and on Against the Grain. That's the story I know best, and I've told the most places.
Right.
Naturalicious is a hair care product, which is episode 2 of Against the Grain that comes out in a couple of weeks, so early September 2020. And they have an incredible story because they have this group of women on their Facebook page or Facebook group called The Nation that operates more like a sisterhood. And they help people through, abusive relationships. They raise money for each other to get out of those abusive relationships. They help people when they're in the hospital and all the fun stuff too. Like we talked to people who told that Facebook group they were engaged before they told their parents. And it's like, there's tremendous stories bottled up in Naturalicious too. But it's not that I like any one story. I like the practice of making stories, and I like how it makes me feel to like put that work out in the world and also see the reaction from people. Like it's addicting to me to be on a stage and see people light up or think critically, or, there's this moment when you're doing public speaking that I came up with a phrase to describe it. I call it quieter than quiet. A lot of what happens in a room with, a performance on a stage doesn't have to be just speaking. Could be a musician, could be a comedian. It happens because yes, the performer's doing it, but also what happens around you in the crowd. Like people laughing gives you a certain permission to laugh yourself. Like think of when you're alone in a room watching TV, you're not belly laughing quite as much as you are in the room. And yes, part of that is because you're physically there, but a lot of it is you're surrounded by people sharing that emotion. And that elevates the emotion. It amps it up in a way you can't get elsewhere, which is why virtual talks are so difficult to create real impact in. And so quieter than quiet is when someone makes a cogent point and you're like telling about a hardship or there's a downturn in the action and you pause and everybody's dead silent. It feels more quiet. It feels quieter than the normal quiet because everybody around you you're noticing is dead silent too. And so that's the stuff I love. It's not necessarily an individual story. It's the fact that I get to like understand the human condition and understand myself and convey emotion through those stories. So like the Bourdain punchline of all this is he talked about, he said once, I think I like making stuff. I like the act of like putting all the parts and pieces together. And he said, it's something about being a chef where you put that plate in the window and for one tiny golden moment, you're like, that's pretty good. I made that, but then you're immediately on to the next thing. So that's kind of how I feel. It's like, I have these golden moments where I just put it out into the world and I'm like, hey, that's pretty good. But then I have so many other things I need to get to or want to get to that I have to stop thinking about that one story.
Yeah. Makes sense. Jay, what's a question that you feel most people should be asking that they don't ask enough or at all?
What is this for? What is this for? Right now, a big part of my business is running an organization called Marketing Showrunners. And so we teach makers and marketers how to create great podcasts. We talk about, you're not here to make a podcast. You're here to make a difference in the life of your audience, in your career, for your brand. You're here to make a difference. It just so happens to be audio. When we talk about that, the reason we anchor you to that is because that's what it's for, right? Shows are for certain things in general, like they have general traits about them, but then the specifics of how you're making a difference on your show with you as the host for your audience. And it's so bizarre that so often we want that general answer, back to the whole best practice versus best for you. We want to know, oh, should I launch a podcast for my brand? Jay, tell me, why should anyone launch a podcast? Can't give you that. Can't tell you. It's a tool, right? What are you trying to build and why? And so we too often forget those basic questions. Like your audience of a consumed experience of any kind, your audience is going to have this critical question on their mind that we don't answer often enough, which is whether they're new to you or coming back for more. They want to know this. What will be different when I'm done? So they're asking, what is this for me, the audience member? So we need to ask that more often. What is this for? Because then everything else flows from that. How we produce it, who we think we're targeting, how we measure success. It's very easy to say, what is this for? Sales, leads, building the brand.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not nuanced enough. Like if you're creating a basketball team and you're like, all right, at shooting guard, well, given our system, given the current makeup of the rest of our players, what is that position for right now? And I can't prove that because Jay is standing in the corner and Jay is a deadly 3-point threat. I can't prove with some metric somewhere that our lead scorer was able to drive to the hoop more easily because defenses had to spread out and pay attention to Jay, who didn't ever get the ball and didn't shoot, right? But That's what Jay's there for. That's what he's for. So we have to measure it accordingly, right? It's not going to look like in marketing parlance, like a pixel with a stat, with a chart generated for you, right? If you're measuring a podcast, what is a podcast for? What is this particular podcast for? We don't ask that of our careers. We don't ask that of our relationships. It's so simple. What is this for? Makes a lot more things make sense.
For sure. Last question for you then. What's a question that you wish more people asked you?
That's a really good question. It's more of a structure of question than it is a specific question. It's like the type of question, or maybe the purpose of it.
Yeah.
So what I've noticed is, when I'm interviewed for a blog, a newsletter, a podcast, a video series, I'm trying, for example, in this interview, not to rehash old stories and sound bites, because I hate when guests of mine do that. But it's so easy sometimes for me to do that on other shows because people ask the same questions.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes rooted in a lack of research on the guest, but more often it's rooted in a lack of specificity of audience. And again, asking, what is this for my audience? What's my podcast for my audience? So the type of question I wish I got more was like, hey, let me tell you a little bit about our audience and some of the things we're hearing from them. Okay, given what we know, or given that specific thing about the audience, Jay, here's my question for you. So you can take the same exact general question, like what makes a good story? That could be asked on any podcast. How does that question actually manifest on your show, Michael, versus my show about podcasting, or my other show about storytelling, or another person's show about, I don't know, healthcare marketing? We don't necessarily use our show premises or any concept of any project as a decision-making filter, but it should necessarily change the way we ask questions because it's rooted in a reason it exists, where we know what it's for, right? And then also who it's for. And that alters the question. So I can't give you one question, but I do wish people would explain to me exactly why they're asking certain questions in service to their audience, and then we can have a conversation to help that audience together.
I love that. And the purpose of this show is to help people ask better questions. So I think you just gave my audience a great tip there to end with, man. So Jay, I appreciate your time. I know things are busy and crazy for everybody, and I just appreciate you coming on and sharing the stories that you've had the fortune to be involved with, man. It's really interesting work. I love following your work. Keep it up, and I hope we can stay in touch. All right.
Thank you so much for saying that. And your listeners need to know that while you're not publishing a video, we're looking at each other over Zoom, and I'm seeing you write down notes, and I'm seeing you ask questions by looking off camera to think about it. The questions you asked me were unlike any questions I've gotten on other shows, and it's clear that you care about this craft. And I know it's an effort, but it's not like you had to spend 6 weeks more to prep for this episode than most people. It's just this tiny bit of effort that you've put in. And I have no doubt that's going to serve you well on this show, but also everywhere else. And I think your listeners can take a big, big lesson from you doing that.
That means so much. Thank you for that. As one former sports journalist to another, that's awesome, man. I appreciate it more than I can say. So
my pleasure. This was so much fun.
Many thanks to Jay Acunzo for his time and insight on the show today. Please do me and Jay a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to today's conversation. Share this episode with your network and help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you have it in your heart, please leave a rating and review of this show wherever you may be listening. If you know someone who you think would be a great guest on the follow-up question, or have a question you'd like me to address on a future episode, email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com or go to thefollowupquestion.com/contact and submit a guest recommendation. If you want to improve your own ability to listen and ask questions, hop over to thefollowupquestion.com/newsletter and subscribe. And when you do, I'll send you my free guide, the 10 follow-up questions guaranteed to keep a conversation going. You'll also be the first to know about new content and fresh tips and tricks. And that's all free when you subscribe at thefollowupquestion.com/newsletter. All those links are in the show notes, including how to contact today's guest, Jay Acunzo. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until next time, keep asking questions.